back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Can I get up with it? Can I get up with it?
And welcome back to The Law Show on CL 650. I'm Zach Spencer, and today we're talking about immigration law on The Law Show. Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic are my guests, and they're from the law firm MKS in downtown Vancouver, a boutique law firm specializing in immigration law. And we're talking about the Citizenship Act that's gone through the House. It's now stuck in the Senate, and how amendments to the act would change actions were taken by the previous Conservative government. So this whole issue of revocation has come up. It's been in the news because the numbers over the last few years have been, 5 or 6 or 8 people. And then in the last 18 months, it's gone up to like 150 people. And there's some questions being asked around the Liberal government. Well, this was a heavy hand of the Conservative government, but under the Liberals, there's been more revocations than there was before. So where are we with that? And was there a reason? Is it just the timing of going through all of the
That's
paperwork?
all it is. There's 25, as Rudy said in the last segment, there's 2,500 to 3,000 cases. Mm-hmm. The Conservatives waited to go ahead with them until they passed the law, and all the Liberals are doing.
And that was 2014.
That's right.
Right.
So
it took a while to go through the system.
There's absolutely nothing partisan about that. What has been partisan somewhat is that when Bill C-6 went through the House, this issue was raised and was told at the Commons Committee, no, we're not going to tackle that in this round, even though Minister McCallum, when he was in Vancouver in April, did say he was open to considering some sort of hearing procedure to replace what was in the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act. But that hasn't happened yet. Apparently, they're considering it, and when the current bill in its current form went to second reading at the Senate on September 27th, the adjournment that was put forward by one of the senators, Rina Omidvar, I think, was at least in some part because there was a desire among some of the senators and concern that revocation proceedings were proceeding in this manner without any type of or without sufficient procedural and constitutional safeguards for Canadian citizens, without the hearing right.
Could this actually be a case where the Senate is actually doing something good here and flagging something and saying, send it back to the House for amendments? I mean, is that crazy talk that the Senate's actually doing its job?
I mean, it is. It's a valid point. It is doing its job. I was shocked though because I thought this would be a rubber stamp. I mean, the most of everything that's been brought up in the bill C6 is pretty uncontroversial for the most part for most people, right? And the Liberal Party came in with that.
But this not no ability to have a hearing in a court and have your citizenship, determined by a court versus Ottawa bureaucrat. I mean, I think that's pretty significant.
It's a massive problem, but that's what the Conservatives brought in. This bill just hasn't been set up to address those changes
Why
yet,
would they leave that out?
Well, and this is where I think we can talk a bit about being partisan. I think the reality is there's a feeling in Ottawa that in the civil service ranks that this needs to happen, that there was simply just too many people for them to deal with. They need to send a message that the people that, were involved in citizenship fraud need to be dealt with. And it doesn't matter if they don't have procedural safeguards. I think, or that people don't think there's sufficient procedural
So there's still a tough love element in Ottawa that says we have to send a message that you better not screw around with your application.
I mean, this is not people that misrepresented in the terms of, well, maybe my mother put down my wrong place of birth and it's a minor. These are people that they believe fraudulently misrepresented the amount of days they were in Canada.
Yeah,
but
right?
wouldn't that be? But having an appeal process where they could go in front of a judge or a jury, or however you do it, or a tribunal, something like that, where you could prove that quite easily, wouldn't that?
Yeah, it would solve it. So, there's a lot of solutions. I mean, we have the Immigration Refugee Board here. They would be sort of a natural, they've got 3 tribunals. They could fit it into there where a person had an appeal to the Immigration Appeal Division. There's a natural process that could easily be set up for that. I think the structure's already there,
fair,
but they've decided not to address it that way yet.
So you're saying it's not a class action suit. It's basically a challenge to the charter brought forth by a group of people.
Well, exactly. So a law firm in Toronto, well-known law firm, Lauren Waldman and Associates, on behalf of one case, challenged the constitutionality of the section.
And they can add people to that? Or?
Well, what happened was they asked Justice Zinn of the federal court to stay the revocation proceeding until that constitutional matter was heard. And Justice Zinn did do that, which is somewhat unusual that the federal court stays proceedings until a constitutional question is determined. They don't always do that. Well, what's happened is anyone
just
else...
for the legal aspect of this, because it is the law show, typically there's a ruling and then you appeal it to a higher court. Is that usually how it works?
Typically,
because
yes.
you say it's unconstitutional. So they've actually held it up in that level of court of
federal court.
Federal court
That's
before
right.
it goes to the Supreme Court.
So what they've done is they've said, listen, this provision, because the rights of the people affected are so significant that if you are in the middle of a revocation proceeding, that case will be frozen by our court until such time as this constitutional question is determined. And since this applies to anyone in this situation, anyone who wants to can have it apply to them.
Because one judge has said that's the case in this one case, that applies to anybody that's in the same situation.
That's right.
So that's precedent,
It
even
is,
though
it is.
there hasn't been a ruling on that
absolutely.
case.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and
Because even just a court, what would you call that, motion?
Well, it is an interlocutory motion in the sense that it's an interim thing. Mm-hmm. But I think it's being motivated by two things. One, the consequences are really stark. Like you lose your citizenship, the ball gets rolling on a whole bunch of other things that may be irreparable. Once you're deported, they've sent you home to another country. I mean, what's there left to really discuss? I mean, so from that perspective, I think Justice Zinn was concerned that the consequences are so high. So that's part of it. And two, the question itself is important enough that the court has devoted a timetable to having it heard that's a bit on the accelerated side. They're already going to have a hearing in November. So it sort of makes sense to not allow any of these other cases to go forward without the court ruling on constitutionality first.
So that's the Supreme Court is going to rule on that?
The federal court is going to rule on that.
The federal court,
yes.
Okay.
And then, unfortunately, what that means, though, is you foreshadowed this earlier in your comment, Zach, and that is that if there is a question, where do we go from the federal court trial division?
Federal Court of Appeal, and then we can go to the Supreme Court. Yeah, which could take 2 to 3 years.
Wouldn't it have just been quicker to have an appeal process and a tribunal look at it?
I was involved in a class action lawsuit years ago, and when it came to settlement, it was actually with Lorne, and the government had changed the rules in terms of how they were going to process immigration applications, had changed them, and then basically told everybody else to get lost. We're going to keep your money, and the rules have changed, and you're not qualifying. We're sending all your applications back, and we're going to keep your money. And when it came time to settle with the government, it was clear that the calculations that the government had done were set up such that, okay, we'll process these applications, but we're going to take 3 years because we know it's going to take you 3 years to get the Supreme Court of Canada if we do this and you guys win. So you might as well take this deal because you're not going to get any better if we fight it, right? So they clearly did that process. And here...
They did the math on it,
They did the math and said, listen, we'll see if they bring it, and if not, we might be saving money anyway. Right? It's not about justice. It's about practicality at the end of the day, not what's right.
Okay, so I'm guessing there's sort of two sort of camps here. There are people like our senator whose mother put down the wrong place of birth, and that's just a sort of a clerical sort of error. It's not really, she's not trying to skirt any kind of rules. It's just something that happened. And then you get the people who are making false claims or coming to our country and saying they haven't been a criminal in another country, and they've basically become a citizen by falsely. So is that kind of the two camps you have now? With
revocation, with the misrepresentation question, really it falls down to people who lied about something in their past that's significant. Such as, you had a criminal record in China that you've hidden, or your identity, or something significant like that, or you've simply lied about the amount of days that you've spent in Canada.
Right.
The big scandals that drove this, that drove the investigations between 2006 and 2008, and that resulted with several immigration consultants going to prison. And in our Vancouver example, which is New Can Consulting, Sonny Wang, who got a 6-year prison sentence for running a ring that did this also. In their instance, they were accused of manufacturing passport stamps. Other scams included creating fake lives for people by taking a power of attorney on a credit card and then running the transaction in the client's name, but the consultant actually doing it,
right,
and then showing bank statements that he'd actually been in Canada when he wasn't.
Toronto, they were the one consultant out of Toronto was actually claiming a GST rebate, applying for social assistance, and then getting it all mailed to the same address. And what happened was the officer got tipped
they say
off.
they don't catch the smart ones, right?
Well, and they went to this address. They went to the door. They opened the door. It was a brick wall behind it. There wasn't even anything there where it was getting delivered to this basement suite that was blocked.
And meanwhile, what was the number? It was like 100 people had claimed that they lived in the same address?
And we're getting sort of rent subsidies or something from the Ontario government that they were then using as evidence that they were living in Canada.
And it was actually the Ontario Rentals Board
that found out,
who started the investigation and alerted the federal agencies to it.
So, I mean, there was a failing clearly under the bureaucrats to sort of, do some vetting of who was applying, asking for what they weren't asking. When you looked at the old applications, the way they were processed without putting in tax returns, proof that you're in school, some sort of proof that you're actually
so basic.
Here.
I mean,
you weren't asking for any of that.
You apply to get a 1-year lease in an apartment. You've got to come up with,
private business versus government.
Well, it isn't just that, though. I mean, I think we need to harken back a little bit to immigration history here. I mean, this coincides with Canada as being a passport, transitioning from a place where you only go to work and live to also being a place where you sometimes work and live and passport of convenience. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of these motivating drives to skirting the residency obligation were because people never really intended to live here anyway. In the cases in Montreal and Toronto, there was a very strong Gulf element to them. When I say the Gulf, in the Gulf, it's well known that if you are working in Qatar or Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates, that if you're doing the same job but have a Filipino or an Egyptian passport and a Canadian passport, you'll get paid 3 or 4 times more if you have as a Canadian.
Wow.
So what people were doing...
what's the value of your passport then, Zach?
It's worth a lot.
Right, it's worth a lot. So what people were doing were immigrating to Canada, not because they wanted to immigrate to Canada, but it was to get the Canadian passport.
That's the classic passport of convenience.
That's it. Right?
All right, I want to take a quick break. We're going to come back and pick up on that. I also want to get into more immigration into our country. It seems to be a trend of the last government and this government. We're speaking with Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law, immigration lawyers in downtown Vancouver. We'll pick it up next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.